Welcome to Darkness Notes, from haunted churches to sinister secrets lost in sacred silence. This is your sanctuary for the unsettling. Now we start the story. They said it was the wind, but wind doesn't whisper names you've never told anyone, and it sure as hell doesn't cry like a child you buried years ago. This isn't a ghost story, it's worse. Because what you're about to hear happened not in the Middle Ages, not in a remote jungle or some wartime gulag, but in the green, peaceful hills of Virginia, in the very soil that birthed the American dream. Something unholy took root, and for over 20 years it thrived under the illusion of decency. Behind whitewashed wood and wraparound porches, behind hymns and Sunday dresses, a truth festered, so vile it had to be sealed underground behind chains, behind brick, behind silence. What you've been told about this country, about its foundations, its sanctity, its moral compass, was a mask, a narrative painted in brushstrokes of virtue, while beneath the canvas, a different story boiled like rot beneath fresh paint. The Sullivan family wasn't just an anomaly. They were a symptom of a sickness we've never cured, of a game played by people who understand that power isn't about wealth or status, but about control, psychological, physical, generational. In 1834, a basement was opened, and inside were children not related, not raised, but harvested, aged 6 to 16, shackled to walls like livestock, unable to even scream anymore. They weren't just kidnapped, they were transformed, fragmented, reprogrammed, and made into obedient ghosts. Ghosts who lived. The woman they called mother wasn't nurturing. She was something else, entirely an architect of fear. Her name was Constance Sullivan, and her methods weren't madness. They were methods. She understood how to break a child, how to erase identity, how to implant loyalty through punishment and reward. What we now call psychological warfare she had weaponized in the age of candles and crop fields. This is not just the story of the Sullivan basement. This is the blueprint for a deeper system hidden in history, replicated across institutions, and fed to the public in digestible lies. And once you understand how it worked, you'll start to see it everywhere, in places you never thought to look, in systems you were raised to trust. What you are about to hear is forbidden knowledge, and once it's in you it doesn't come out. Welcome to the descent. And Millbrook, Virginia. The year is 1776. While the colonies shout about liberty and revolution, a quiet farmhouse stands outside town, untouched by war but soaked in something far older, not blood, ritual, and that house belonged to the first generation of the Sullivan line. What you know as the Sullivan basement didn't begin with Constance Sullivan in 1834. No, that was just a chapter that got exposed. The rot goes deeper rooted in a time when the founding fathers were writing liberty with one hand and signing off on human possession with the other. Ezra Sullivan's grandfather Emery Sullivan wasn't a farmer, not truly. He was a recruiter, a collector, and beneath that same farmhouse, long before chains rusted on stone walls, Emery was laying the foundation for something that would survive generations. In his journals, found only decades later, sealed in wax and buried in the crawlspace beneath the hearth, he described children not as people, but as vessels. Emery believed that a child was pure potential, not in the sentimental sense, but as raw material to be shaped, stripped, and reforged. And he wasn't working alone. The entries referenced visitors, travelers from Boston, Philadelphia, even Europe, who came not for crops, but for the work. The names were always abbreviated, but the practices clear: sensory deprivation, language erasure, identity isolation. The very techniques used in modern black site interrogations, McCulture programs, and cult indoctrination practiced in a dim cellar before the Declaration of Independence was even dry. But here's the part most people refuse to see. This wasn't insane. It was intentional. These were experiments. Quiet, generational experiments, testing how long a mind could be kept loyal without family, without name, without self, testing how obedience could be drilled, not with whips, but with parables of mother's love and the outside world as evil. If the subject obeyed, they were fed. If they disobeyed, they were corrected. Over time, they stopped disobeying. This is how you manufacture a compliant population, not through laws, but belief systems, emotional shackles, cognitive cages. And while you're meant to see this as an isolated horror, a deranged farmhouse in the Virginia woods, I'm telling you, this was a prototype, a microcosm of how institutional power works, how it's always worked. Because the real chain isn't made of iron, it's the one you never see, ready to go deeper. You've been taught that America was founded on freedom, but ask yourself, freedom for whom? While the ink dried on Jefferson's Declaration, the Sullivan cellar was already in operation underground, both literally and figuratively. And that's the part most can't stomach, that this nation's birth was not a clean break from tyranny, but a trade deal, a handoff. From crown to capital, from monarchy to oligarchy, different uniforms, same chains. The Sullivan method didn't just survive, it was absorbed, refined, taken from the fringe and embedded into the architecture of systems you still trust. If Constance Sullivan was a monster, then what do we call the orphan trains of the 1850s? What do we call the residential schools, where native children were stripped of language and lineage, told their gods were lies, their families erased, their obedience demanded in exchange for survival? Different basement, same blueprint. You want to know how these systems persist? It's not by brute force, it's through perception control. Make the lie feel safe, make the truth feel dangerous. When the children chained beneath the Sullivan farm cried for help, no one came. Not because no one heard, but because the explanation was already in place. They're just shy, they're orphans, they're being cared for, and that's the trick. Get the public to believe the cover story, and suddenly, the prison disappears even when it's in plain sight. Here's the part you need to understand, and it's going to hurt. The same psychological operations used in that cellar are still used today, just more polished, more clinical, applied to media, to education, to you, positive reinforcement for compliance, fear for deviation, isolation disguised as independence, distraction disguised as freedom. You are trained not to ask questions, but to fear the discomfort of answers. You are taught to see horror as history, not as infrastructure. Constance Sullivan didn't need guards. She didn't need guns. She used stories, labels, rewards, the oldest tools in the arsenal of control. And here's the most disturbing part: when the investigators finally breached that basement, the children didn't run, they looked confused. Some even cried when she was arrested. Not because they loved Herb, because they didn't know anything else. That is the goal of real power, not just to trap your body, but to convince you that the cage is home. Still think this story is ancient history. The chains in the Sullivan basement were crudion, rusted, bolted to stone, but the chains that replaced them were far more elegant, softer, invisible, and by 1800 they were already being fitted not to ankles, but to minds. When the Sullivan operation began to grow, Constance made a critical shift. She stopped taking only runaways and orphans. She started targeting the system itself. Records uncovered from the Enrico County Archive revealed that she had contacts in almshouses, workhouses, and early poor law institutions, places overflowing with children no one would miss. Children labeled deficient, abandoned, unfit, labels that gave society permission to forget them. And this was the secret. Constance had mastered labels as weapons. Once a person has been labeled by the system, they're no longer seen as fully human. They become property, data, a file. You think that ended in the 1800s? Look again: criminal, extremist, undesirable. The label changes, but the dehumanization stays the same. You don't need a cellar if the public already agrees the prisoner deserves it. By 1820, she had developed a vetting process. Children were assessed, scored, and documented in ledgers that rival modern psychological profiles. Compliance levels, aggression triggers, trauma responses. This wasn't random cruelty, it was research. Controlled conditioning trials performed under the radar. In a farmhouse churchgoers waved at on Sundays. And here's where it gets darker. Many of these techniques appeared decades later in government-funded experiments. From the sterilization programs of the 1900s to Project Bluebird, Artichoke, and later McUltra. You think that knowledge just appeared? No, it was harvested, handed down, cultivated in the shadows. And where did they test it first? On the powerless, the discarded, children without voices. And every time someone got close to exposing it, they were neutralized, discredited, or convinced that what they saw was a fluke, an isolated evil. But it never was. Constance Sullivan didn't just break children, she engineered silence. She weaponized empathy, bending it into compliance. The townspeople didn't turn a blind eye because they were evil. They did it because she gave them a story that made evil look like kindness. And that's the most effective form of control, wearing a friendly face. So the question you need to ask yourself isn't how she got away with it. It's who taught her how. They want you to think Constance Sullivan was a madwoman, an anomaly, a disturbed widow in a farmhouse with a twisted mind and no help. Because as long as you believe that, you'll never ask the next question: who funded her? Investigators in 1834 didn't ask that either. They were too horrified by what they saw: the filth, the chains, the bodies. They assumed it was local, personal, contained. but hidden among the scattered records found beneath the farmhouse were fragments they couldn't explain, letters, receipts, pages coded in cipher, not written in Constance's hand but in another's, signed with a seal never traced to any local institution, and a mark that would later reappear in the archives of certain benevolent societies of the era. That symbol, a triangle within a circle, intersected by a vertical line, appeared again in documents tied to early child relocation programs out of Boston, New Haven, and London, and wherever that mark appeared, children vanished, not to homes, to facilities, remote, private, sealed from public view. The Sullivan basement wasn't the only one. You see, Constance wasn't just operating a prison, she was testing a model, a behavioral conditioning matrix disguised as charity, and she reported her results, delivered them by hand. To who, we still don't fully know, but we have their shadows. Early 19th century records show a sudden uptick in philanthropic societies devoted to childhood reform, many of which were run not by educators but by retired intelligence officers from British colonial territories, men trained in suppression, interrogation, and compliance systems, men who understood that controlling a population doesn't begin at adulthood, it begins in childhood. And here is the chilling part. Their goal was never to help these children, it was to test them, to observe how identity could be dissolved, how obedience could be instilled without whips, how to erase without leaving a mark. That knowledge was invaluable, and the Sullivan farm, forgotten by textbooks, dismissed as an outlier, was a training ground. By the time it was raided in 1834, the core experiment was already complete. The method was proven and it was scalable. So tell me, do you still think this was about a single family? Or have you begun to realize, this wasn't a basement, it was a laboratory? After the Sullivan raid in 1834, the story should have ended. The house should have been razed, the records destroyed, the methods buried. But none of that happened. Instead, something stranger occurred, something colder. Within 5 years, several key figures who investigated the Sullivan case were promoted. Sheriff Crawford was transferred to Washington. Deputy Webb retired early, bought land mysteriously paid for in gold, and vanished from public life. The court files sealed, misfiled, some lost in a fire. But the real legacy of the Sullivans wasn't legal, it was institutional. In the following decade, religious orphanages across the eastern seaboard adopted eerily similar practices: regimentation, silence during meals, punishment for emotion, the removal of given names, and the imposition of numerical identifiers. All of it cloaked in piety, discipline, and the language of character building. And what's worse, these places were praised for their efficiency, their cleanliness, their success in turning troubled children into productive members of society. But those who emerged from these institutions weren't thriving, they were hollowed. And that's the pattern, isn't it? What starts as horror becomes normalized, then standardized. And always it hides behind virtue. The Sullivan basement wore the mask of charity. So did the orphan trains, the residential schools, the moral rehabilitation centers. You see the thread now, don't you? It's not a straight line. It's a spiral, a refinement. Generation by generation, the tools got sharper, less obvious, more psychological. The chains became routines. The isolation became curriculum. And the stories they were told made them believe it was for their own good. That's how you scale mind control. Make it look like education. Wrap obedience in morality. Punish independence as selfishness. Reward submission as maturity. Constance Sullivan didn't disappear. She multiplied. Her methods were whispered into seminaries, passed between educational reformers, and quietly incorporated into elite boarding schools. Not because those schools wanted cruelty, but because they wanted control, predictability. Order. They weren't educating future leaders, they were formatting them, erasing the unpredictable, installing compliance, masking conformity as excellence. And if any child resisted, they were labeled disturbed, expelled, removed, forgotten, and the rest. The rest became the very men who would go on to lead corporations, write laws, build empires, and never question whose script they were following. You still think it's about history. This is about the system you live in. The children chained in the Sullivan basement weren't just victims, they were templates. And once the method proved effective, once silence, obedience, and total identity replacement could be achieved, wasn't the poor who were targeted. Next. It was the elite. You see, the real game isn't about suppressing the bottom, it's about programming the top. By the mid-1800s, a strange transformation was taking place in America's upper echelons. New institutions were rising: prep schools, private academies, military training centers, places where the sons of powerful families were sent not to be nurtured, but to be broken and rebuilt, with cold routines, Spartan conditions, hierarchical discipline, and psychological indoctrination disguised as character formation. Sound familiar? At St. Dunstan's Academy in Massachusetts, an institution with deep ties to early federal military networks, cadets were subjected to weeks of isolation upon arrival. No names, no mirrors, no personal items, just silence, uniformity, and rules. By day 30, most stopped speaking unless spoken to. By day 60, they marched, ate, studied, and prayed in perfect synchronization. By day 90, they had been stripped of whatever individuality their parents sent them in with, and what emerged was exactly what the system wanted: a reliable executor, cold, sharp, and loyal to hierarchy. These weren't boarding schools, they were mind-forging chambers. And guess who sat on their boards? Retired generals, secretaries of state, former intelligence heads, men whose fortunes were built not just on power but on the understanding that power is useless if not transferred, if not reproduced. And so it was. The Sullivan method, rebranded, was now called character building, mental toughness, leadership development. But behind the slogans was the same core formula: deprive, isolate, break, rebuild, because a man who's had his will shattered and reconstructed doesn't question orders. He doesn't ask why the system works the way it does. He enforces it, protects it, expands it. That's why the most dangerous prisoners of the Sullivan method weren't the children in chains. They were the ones who survived it and went on to rule. You think this is about some farmhouse horror in 1834? No, that was just the beta test. The real program, the one still running, was never about hiding evil in the shadows. It was about teaching the powerful to build their rule from them. By now you understand the Sullivan method wasn't buried. It was enshrined, preserved not in textbooks, but in ritual, in initiation, in silence. Because true power doesn't just erase history, it sanctifies its horrors, calls them sacred, and passes them on. As the 19th century turned, new organizations began to rise: private, secretive, and elite. Not governments, not businesses, networks, brotherhoods. You know the names, even if you were taught not to ask what they really do: Skull and Bones, the Order of Nine, the Pilgrim Society. And behind them, shadow finances and intergenerational bloodlines obsessed not just with wealth but with obedience, secrecy, and grooming successors who would never betray the code. What do all these groups have in common? Initiation through humiliation. Call it bonding, tradition, but peel away the pageantry and you find the same architecture as the Sullivan basement: isolation, psychological destabilization, identity breakdown, followed by selective reintegration. The new initiate is taught: your old self is dead. You now belong to us, and once a man has willingly endured degradation to enter a circle of power, he'll do anything to stay inside. Anything. That's how control perpetuates. Declassified memos from early OSS briefings, America's pre-CIA intelligence, wing detail conditioning techniques pulled straight from the Sullivan model: sensory deprivation, trauma triggers, identity erosion. These weren't theories, they were protocols. And they weren't invented in laboratories. They were extracted from centuries of shadow knowledge, tested in basements, refined in schools, and perfected in cults of influence. What did they want? Not soldiers, architects, men who could pass through every gate, say every right word, wear every mask, and never once flinch because their minds had already been fragmented and rebuilt. Men who could train others, shape policy, guide nations, without ever questioning whose plan they were truly following. And so, by the early 1900s, the Sullivan legacy had ascended, no longer just in the hands of a sadistic matriarch in Virginia but encoded into the very rites of ascent for the powerful, a language spoken only by those willing to pay in silence, because that's the final price of admission. You don't just lose your past, you lose the right to speak about what was done to you. That's how darkness survives. Not by hiding, but by turning its victims into gatekeepers. World War II wasn't just fought with tanks and bullets, it was fought with psychology. Behind every battlefield was a laboratory, and behind every flag, a hidden agenda. In the 1940s, both Axis and Allied powers began deploying tactics that mirrored the very core of the Sullivan method: dehumanization, identity erasure, trauma bonding, and perhaps most telling, the use of children. Germany had the Hitler Youth, the US had the Civilian Conservation Corps, Japan had the Imperial Youth. But these weren't just programs, they were conditioning farms, testing grounds to see how deeply ideology could be embedded. how fully a child's identity could be shaped by engineered trauma, isolation, repetition, and who advised these programs: psychiatrists, behavioral scientists, and behind-the-curtain figures tied to early secret societies and the same prep schools that once adopted the Sullivan model in 1943. Allied intelligence launched Operation Paperclip, a quiet rescue of over 1,600 Nazi scientists. Officially, they were taken for their rocket knowledge, but many were psychologists, experts in torture, behavior modification, human experimentation, the kind of men who kept meticulous notes on how to fracture the human psyche and reassemble it into something useful, something obedient, something programmable. Among their research were references in direct, coded but clear to prior American experiments. One document refers to Conditioning Case S12V, a designation uncannily close to Sullivan 12, Virginia. Coincidence, or buried proof that what the Nazis did in camps was already being tested decades earlier in basements. The Sullivan method was never about torture for its own sake. It was about breaking the self to make space for programming. The war merely gave it scale justification. It gave scientists access to millions of human subjects, unrestrained by ethics, oversight, or conscience, and when the war ended, the experiments didn't stop. They just changed their names. MKULTRA Project, Chatter, Bluebird, Artichoke.org, hidden behind patriotism, all funded with black budgets, all rooted in one premise: a mind once broken can be rebuilt to serve. And that's the real horror. Not that such projects existed, but that they worked. The basement in Virginia may have been the beginning, but by 1950, the whole world had become a testing ground. Hospitals, schools, military bases, even television. Control wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The war ended, the flags were folded, but the experiment scaled because by 1950, the battlefield wasn't Europe. It wasn't the Pacific. It was your mind. And the new weapon, not bombs, not bullets. The Sullivan method, once chains and starvation in a candlelit basement, had evolved. What was once done with physical isolation was now done with narrative control. And the battlefield wasn't underground anymore, it was in your living room. 1951, a private think tank known as the Tavistock Institute, working with American and British intelligence, publishes internal memos detailing the use of media as a behavior-regulating environment. Their words, not mine. They weren't just studying propaganda, they were crafting psychological enclosures, reality tunnels where the audience no longer thought but responded. Sound familiar? Because the model hadn't changed. The tools had. Silence became noise. Chains became screens. Isolation became algorithmic. Suggestion. And once again it started with children. Children's programming in the 1950s was guided by developmental psychologists, many of whom had ties to MKULTRA, Stanford Research Institute, and Tavistock itself. But behind the cheerful puppets and jingles were tested rhythms designed to regulate brainwaves, bypass critical thought, and create emotional dependency on characters and the screen itself. By age 6, a child had spent more hours in front of a TV than in conversation with their own parents. By age 12, they had absorbed more visual violence, humiliation rituals, and behavioral modeling than a wartime POW. But this time, there were no basements, no walls. Because now the conditioning was voluntary. That's the brilliance of evolved control. Make the prison feel like freedom. Make the programming entertaining. And the moment you laugh at it, let it in. Corporate sponsors weren't just funding shows, they were refining stimuli, testing which colors, phrases, tones induced obedience, which facial expressions triggered trust, which audio patterns bypassed resistance. And all of it was archived, indexed, shared. Between intelligence agencies, between corporate boards, between media empires. The Sullivan method wasn't erased. It was COMMODIFIED. Your trauma became profit. Your attention, currency. Your compliance, the product. And now, the basement doesn't need chains or locks, because now, you carry it in your pocket. By the late 1950s, something unthinkable had begun to happen, not overtly, not with force, but with an eerie surgical precision. People stopped asking why, not because the answers were hidden, but because the questions themselves had been deleted. What began in the basement with chains, what grew through war and was broadcast through glowing screens, had now evolved into the final stage of the Sullivan method: erasure of memory, suppression of inquiry, normalization of silence. This wasn't about censorship in the traditional sense. It wasn't jackboots and book burnings. It was subtler. Entire generations grew up thinking certain thoughts were crazy, that asking about who really controls the schools or why certain symbols repeat in media made you paranoid, that questioning history itself made you dangerous. Where did that reaction come from? It was installed in school systems designed around compliance metrics, not curiosity. In television that replaced grandmothers' stories with corporate scripts, in textbooks that omitted entire centuries of indigenous, occult, or suppressed knowledge but somehow always found space for sanitized patriotic myth. And underneath it all, a quiet force hummed ensuring that the original trauma remained invisible. Because trauma isn't always loud, sometimes it's the absence of something that should have been there, like a child never learning their real name, like a nation never being told its real history, like a family line forgetting the wound that keeps repeating. Generation after generation, wondering why love always turns to fear. That's the genius of the method. You don't need to control the truth. If you can control what's askable. Once the range of acceptable thought is narrowed, the mind becomes its own prison. The population begins policing each other, laughing at those who remember, silencing those who question, celebrating the destruction of their own past as progress. And this didn't happen in a day, it took decades. A slow erosion of cultural memory, rituals replaced with slogans, ancestors replaced with celebrities, storytelling replaced with programming. And now, you don't even need chains, because if you've forgotten the questions, you'll never find the door. You think in words, you feel in symbols, you remember in language. So what happens if the language itself is rewritten? By the 1960s, the Sullivan method had completed its most insidious evolution, not just shaping behavior, not just suppressing memory, but rewiring thought at the source. Language. Because if you can't say it, you can't think it. This wasn't new. Every regime in history knew the power of controlling speech. But what emerged in post-war America was different. This wasn't overt censorship, it was semantic engineering. Psychologists embedded in government, agencies, think tanks, and universities began introducing subtle linguistic shifts. Words with deep, primal meaning, father, freedom, truth, nation, were diluted, reframed, or mocked. And new terms, clinical, bloodless, sterile, were introduced in their place. No more betrayal, now it was non-alignment. No more lies, just misinformation. No more slavery, only systems of compliance. The power of a word like evil was replaced by words like dysfunctional. Possessed became neurotic, haunted became delusional, and in doing so, the emotional voltage of language was neutered. Words that once moved armies or protected children were now punchlines in psychology textbooks. Meanwhile, media, academia, and even religious institutions reinforced the shift, not through mandates, but through repetition, satire, social pressure. If you spoke in the old ways, you were ignorant. If you dared use forbidden words, you were unstable. That it wasn't just about what you were allowed to say, it was about what you were afraid to think. The Sullivan method had mutated into linguistic trauma conditioning. The same way a beaten child flinches before a raised hand, now an entire population flinched before speaking certain truths. And the final twist, they blamed you for it. You're overreacting, you misunderstood, don't be dramatic. So you gaslight yourself, you bury the truth you were about to say, and just like that, the system wins again. That's how control sustains itself. Not by screaming commands, but by slowly destroying your ability to name what's happening to you. Because if you can't name the monster, you'll never know it's eating you. Some memories don't fade, they burn. Scattered across the 1960s and 70s, reports began surfacing, unpublished, ignored, sometimes lost. Reports from former children, now adults, who remembered what others forgot. Basements, masks, knocks, rituals, names. They didn't speak clearly at first. How could they? Most had never been allowed to finish a sentence without punishment. Their minds weren't damaged, they were fragmented, like puzzles missing half the box. But something inside them refused to stay silent, and when they finally spoke, they all said the same thing. It wasn't just a family, it was a program. Men and women from completely different states, backgrounds, even decades apart, began recalling nearly identical experiences. Isolation, identity stripping, behavioral drills enforced through reward and pain, and above all, don't talk about the basement. They were called mentally ill. They were medicated, institutionalized, silenced. But then came the patterns. Therapists and investigative journalists, who dared to listen, noticed chilling commonalities in these delusions. Names of towns that didn't appear on maps, symbols drawn the same way by people who'd never met, repeated references to rooms with red doors, clocks with no hands, and mirrors facing each other. These weren't random. They were architectural constants, elements designed for psyche fracturing. The Sullivan fingerprints were everywhere beneath new names, inside foster systems, experimental schools, even elite summer camps. One survivor, a woman named Eleanor Kay, wrote in her journal, "They broke me to rebuild me, but they forgot something. I remember what I was before. I remember who I was supposed to be. And every night I feel her trying to come back." She was found dead in 1982. Official cause, overdose. But no substance was detected. Just a final note, burned into the paper: they're still here, still building, still choosing. What was she referring to? Who were they still choosing? And why did so many who remembered who documented their pain die mysteriously? Because the truth isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. Because if even one survivor proves the Sullivan model was real, was widespread, was systemic, it means everything else is a lie. They no longer need walls, they don't need chains, they don't need to lock you in a room because you bring the room with you. When the internet exploded in the late 1990s, it was hailed as a new dawn, an age of freedom, transparency, connection, but the system didn't lose control, it simply changed clothes. Behind the tech boom were names you were never meant to learn: military contractors, psychological operations units, Tavistock-trained media consultants, and quietly legacy figures, tied to Sullivan's original case, not in name, but in method. Because what was the Sullivan method, really? Input, isolation, feedback, repetition, reward, punishment. Now scroll through any social feed, count the likes, feel the absence when they don't come. Watch how your thoughts shift based on which posts are praised, and which are buried. Not communication, that's conditioning. They replaced the red door with a glowing screen. They replaced the chains with push notifications and the mirror. It's your profile, curated, monitored, modified in real time based on your reactions. Every click is logged, every hesitation, stored, every fear fed back to you in the form of content you think you chose. But you didn't choose it, you were trained into it. In 2002, whistleblowers from DARPA and In-Q-Tel admitted under closed-door sessions that behavioral data from social media platforms was being used to construct predictive models, not just to sell products, but to guide belief. Subtle nudges, micropulses of emotional manipulation, not to control the masses, to make the masses control each other. You feel it, don't you? That moment before you post, that flicker of fear. What if they don't like this? That's the program speaking. That's the digital echo of the Sullivan method. And worst of all, you think it's you. That's the final evolution, when the prisoner builds their own cell, paints it pretty, installs WIF and locks the door from the inside. The world doesn't need a basement anymore because the new basement is everywhere, and no one's screaming because everyone's scrolling. The most effective lies are the ones you're entertained by. As early as the 1960s, intelligence agencies and psychological think tanks began exploring a disturbing idea: if you want to control how a population reacts to a future event, show it to them first as fiction. They called it predictive programming, but it wasn't about predicting anything, it was about preparing. The Sullivan method was always rooted in conditioning, punishment, reward, repetition. But what happens when you inject that method into story, into film, into dreams? In 1997, a children's animated series aired an episode about a global virus beginning in China, causing international lockdowns. It featured visuals nearly identical to what unfolded in 2020. Coincidence, or was it a test to see how the population would emotionally respond to the concept before it became real? That's the brilliance of predictive programming. It uses fiction to implant images, ideas, and outcomes into the subconscious. Then, when the real event occurs, it feels familiar, acceptable, inevitable. It hijacks your natural resistance by wrapping control in entertainment. And children, they're the primary targets. Animated films, bedtime books, and video games are laced with recurring themes. The world ends, and only a centralized authority can save us. Surveillance is safety. Magic and mysticism are evil. Science and compliance are good. Families are broken, but the state is stable. Even fairy tales were rewritten. Old stories where children escaped dark systems were edited, often with darker outcomes that taught obedience as survival. But why? Because if a child feels that resistance is dangerous even in fiction, they'll suppress the instinct before they ever act on it. This is the long game, and it works by the time they're adults. Most people have seen 1,000 versions of their own future delivered by corporations, approved by governments, and wrapped in high-definition wonder. So when that future arrives, they comply without question because somewhere they've already seen it happen. That's not prediction, that's programming. And the Sullivan method is just running silently in the background. Every time you turn on a screen, every time your child watches a film, every time the fiction feels a little too real. Behind every method is a motive. Behind every system, a sponsor. The Sullivan family may have originated the technique, but they weren't the ones who scaled it. By the early 20th century, as their experiments spread through orphanages, psychiatric wards, and secret military bases, a silent consortium began to form comprised of financiers, aristocratic bloodlines, and transnational dynasties who saw in the Sullivan model something more than control. They saw a business model. Think tanks were funded, foundations emerged, but these weren't acts of charity, they were fronts. The Harrington Estate, the Ainsworth Trust, the Thornley Circle, names absent from history books, but woven through every major educational, religious, and psychological shift of the last 100 years. Each ancient, discreet, and generationally trained carried a specific role. One controlled the publishing houses, quietly filtering textbooks, children's literature, even dictionaries. Another infiltrated seminaries and spiritual institutions, replacing initiation with indoctrination. A third specialized in pharmaceuticals, perfecting sedation in a bottle and calling it help. And at the center, a ledger, a record of every test, every result, every failed experiment, and every breakthrough. The Sullivan ledger. Updated, in ciphered ink, passed through untraceable diplomatic channels. Its contents were considered more valuable than gold, because it didn't just hold information, it held blueprints, formulas for altering mass perception, models for reprogramming culture in tenure, cycles. Data on generational trauma response, and above all, instructions for rebuilding society from the inside out. This wasn't conspiracy, this was a legacy business, a multi-generational effort to maintain psychological dominance without ever firing a shot. And it worked, because no one looked where they were told not to. The institutions you trust, accredited by families whose surnames never appear on buildings. The schools your children attend, shaped by funding boards operated by the same bloodlines. The news you consume, owned by holding companies whose shareholders meet in underground retreats, with ritual architecture eerily similar to those early Sullivan estates. Coincidence, or continuation? The Sullivan method didn't die. It evolved, and it was adopted not because it was evil, but because it was profitable. You don't need to sell products when you can sell belief. You don't need to enslave people when you can program them to love the cage. That's not control, that's dynastic sorcery. And it's been quietly ruling the world for over a century. The deeper you dig, the more alone you become. Between 1974 and 2011, over 64 independent researchers, therapists, and investigative journalists who touched on Sullivan-linked material either went missing, were discredited, or died in ways ruled as natural but only after they submitted classified or unpublished reports. Connecting child trauma programs to government or corporate networks. Not one of those reports was ever released to the public. Not one family was given access. 2 full case files. Not one obituary mentioned the word Sullivan, but the patterns, they speak louder than headlines ever could. Dr. Harold Fine, a trauma psychologist from Vermont, published a paper linking early Sullivan experiments to modern behavioral intervention centers used on foster children. He vanished 2 weeks later while on a walk with his dog. Dog returned. Fine did not. Reporter Mia Delano uncovered archived school contracts between a private boarding facility in Maine and a now-defunct mental health foundation with Sullivan-era ties. Before she could publish, her laptop was seized in an unrelated tax raid. Days later, she was found dead in her car inside a locked garage she didn't own. And then there was Corey Liddell, the man who almost broke it all on 1998. Corey claimed to have discovered a microfilm archive stored in a decommissioned psychiatric hospital in Ohio. It included full lists, names of children, test phases, outcomes, and most disturbingly, where some were transferred after graduation. He told 3 friends, then he disappeared. 3 weeks later, a story was planted in local papers that Corey had fled the country amid fraud allegations. No charges, no warrants, no court dates. Just. A narrative that people close to Corey knew. They said he'd been frightened, not of being caught, but of being erased. It's not just memory they erase, he told a confidant. Its presence, it's as if you were never even real. They don't kill truth, they sterilize it, neutralize the messengers, bury the evidence, burn the trail, then fill the void with a pre-written story. They went crazy. They were unstable. Nothing to see here. It's not denial, it's strategic amnesia virus in the public mind. So if you're asking why more people don't expose it, it's because the few who did are gone, and their silence was the final proof. What do you do when survivors start speaking? You don't just silence them, you diagnose them. In the late 1980s, as more adult survivors began recalling buried memories of extreme childhood abuse often involving bizarre rituals, identity fragmentation, and institutional complicity, a strange thing happened. A new term began to surface in mainstream psychology: false memory syndrome. It wasn't a natural discovery, it was a strategy, a weapon, promoted by the newly formed False Memory Syndrome Foundation, FMSF, an organization with funding links to intelligence affiliates and board members with disturbingly convenient backgrounds. Its mission was clear: to discredit recovered memories of abuse, especially those involving systemic, organized trauma. In other words, if someone remembered something too dark, too detailed, too implicating, they were now considered mentally unreliable. Clinicians were instructed to doubt them. Courts began throwing out cases. Media ran stories painting accusers as delusional, fantasy-prone, or brainwashed by recovered memory therapists. But here's the sinister part. The FMSF wasn't filled with neutral scientists. Its founders included parents accused by their own children. Its advisors, people with former government mind control experience. Its mission: to reshape public perception of memory itself. They didn't just attack specific stories, they attacked the idea that memory could hold trauma at all. Memories can't be trusted. Your mind plays tricks. Nothing happened. You're just confused. The Sullivan method was always about psychological manipulation. But this was the next level: gaslighting at scale. Survivors were now caught in a new loop. If they forgot, they were unstable. If they remembered, they were delusional. If they spoke, they were dangerous. And if they stayed silent, the system won. This wasn't science. This was mental counterintelligence. By the 2000s. False memory syndrome was quietly discredited in academic circles, but not before it had erased an entire generation of voices, not before it had permanently broken the legal standing of thousands of abuse cases, not before it had turned the truth into a disease. And yet, the memories persist, scratched into journals, hidden in art, whispers in trauma circles, murmured in prayer, because deep down, they always knew they weren't crazy, they were witnesses, and someone wanted them forgotten. They don't call them asylums anymore, they call them academies, retreats, residential treatment centers. The language changed. The methods didn't. Scattered across remote corners of Montana, Utah, Romania, Cambodia, dozens of facilities operate quietly under the radar of mainstream media, government oversight, or journalistic scrutiny that specialize in behavioral realignment. In other words, reprogramming. But this isn't about helping troubled youth or healing trauma. It's about breaking will, then reconstructing identity based on system-approved templates. Sullivan's original techniques: deprivation, stimulus, conditioning, isolation, language, restructuring, have been modernized. Now it's not chains. It's 24/7 surveillance, sensory control, dietary restriction, and forced emotional journaling. Kids sent here, often by their parents, sometimes for minor defiance, sometimes for being too sensitive, sometimes for simply asking the wrong questions, and always with a contract that reads, "You surrender custody during the duration of the program. No contact permitted. Confidentiality required. Inside, sleep is rationed. Language is controlled. Student must speak in scripts, address staff by number, and are punished for unsanctioned vocabulary. Isolation rooms are reframed as reflection spaces. Medication is administered without full disclosure, and the staff, rarely licensed therapists, more often behavioral technicians trained in compliance reinforcement, not care. But the most disturbing detail: the SIGIL. Nearly every site has one disguised as a logo, a school crest, or a motivational emblem. But when mapped against historical symbols, it's nearly identical to the Sullivan crest, a forgotten design pulled from the family's earliest archives. The twin keys, the downward spiral, the black sun beneath the flame. Coincidence or continuity? One survivor, now 28, recalls a chilling mantra repeated daily: "You are not your story, you are what we shape." Another said, I watched myself disappear. I smiled while it happened. These places are legal. Some are even funded by donors linked to humanitarian causes. But beneath the yoga mats, soft lighting, and smiling testimonials is a chamber, a method, a ghost wearing modern clothes. The Sullivan method didn't vanish, it rebranded. They don't need basements anymore. They have your screen. Every swipe, every pause, every hesitation before clicking like, every word you type, even the ones you delete, it's all recorded, fed into systems modeled not just on advertising, psychology but on Sullivan's core principle: control the perception of reality, and you control the self. Today's behavioral tech didn't emerge in a vacuum. The pioneers of nudging, micro-targeting, and digital persuasion weren't just nerds with code. They were behavioral scientists, funded by institutions, with generational ties to the very families who once backed the Sullivan experiments. And while you scroll, binge, and stream, those systems are studying you, but not just to predict your next purchase. They're mapping your emotional profile. Long you linger on a tragedy, which type of fear captures your attention, what patterns make you compliant, and which make you dangerous. This isn't about ads, this is about manufacturing personality. Social media has become the new orphanage, a self-made echo chamber where users voluntarily isolate themselves, engage in reward-punishment loops, and internalize synthetic values preloaded by code. You post something true, silence. You post something fake but agreeable, applause. You question the system, shadow banned. You promote obedience. Vira, that's not coincidence. That's algorithmic conditioning. What took Sullivan decades to install in basements now takes seconds via notifications. The loops are tighter, the cage is invisible. And now, the method has evolved again with help from AI behavior modeling. Companies run simulations of your future self, projecting how you'll behave 5 years from now based on your reactions today. And if they don't like the projection, they tweak your inputs, just like the early re-education centers. Only now you don't need to be relocated, you just need to be online. Think about it. You carry the cage, you feed it data. You even defend it because it gives you dopamine in exchange for submission. That's not technology. That's psychological colonization. And while you argue about politics, trends, or brand loyalty, the real question goes unasked. Who designed your behavior? Her name was Eleanor Sullivan, the matriarch. The architect. The mother of the method. Most records list her as a grieving widow who turned to religion after her husband's suicide in 1774. But buried deep in the estate's private collection, hid beneath floorboards, behind false walls, and inside locked, lead-sealed boxes, was her truth. 17 leather-bound volumes. Each one handwritten. Each one dated. Each one signed with a symbol rather than a name. Inside, not memoirs. Not prayers, but blueprints, psychological trials, ritual observations, children's responses to fear stimuli, loss of language, temperature manipulation, and enforced belief substitution. And yet, beneath the clinical horror was something stranger. Something obsessive. Eleanor didn't just want obedience, she wanted control of identity itself. She wrote, "The child who forgets becomes clay, but the child who remembers falsely becomes a weapon." She wasn't just building trauma loops, she was engineering alternate selves. Each diary entry ends with a mantra, a sort of dark affirmation. They will not become what they were, they will become what we decide. But the final volume, dated October 31st, 1792, is different. No data, no rituals, just drawings, charcoal images, blackened fingers, a face with no eyes, repeated over 100 times, and one final line: "I made something I cannot unmake." They speak to it now. It answers. What did she unleash? A method, a mind, or something beyond? Some researchers believe Eleanor crossed into spiritual obsession, that her experiments weren't just psychological, but ritualistic invocations meant to contact something buried beneath the mind, something old, something hungry, something that feeds on fractured selves. Others think she left the diaries not as instruction but as confession, a record of her descent, a breadcrumb trail out of the labyrinth, because scattered throughout the margins, in handwriting that seems more frantic with each page, appears the same word, remember, over and over. Remember, as if the key to breaking the method was memory itself, not just of what was done, but of who you were before. They called it reversal theory. Not officially, not in journals, but in hidden circles among survivors. Rogue psychologists, ex-cult operatives. It was whispered like a spell, because for every system of control, there's always an echo of resistance. And the reversal theory is that echo, born in shadows, banned in institutions, labeled fringe by every respectable body. But its methods, terrifyingly effective. At its core, the theory proposes this: the Sullivan method doesn't just break you, it replaces you. Your true self isn't gone, it's buried. And if you can unearth it, piece by piece, you can come back, not healed, but whole. It began in the 1980s when a handful of defiant therapists noticed a pattern. Children subjected to Sullivan-style methods often displayed fragmented memory, not from trauma, but from deliberate programming. Their pain wasn't random, it was structured. Their personalities weren't shattered, they were reorganized. So, the rebels tried something new. They stopped asking what happened to you, and started asking, who were you before they changed your name? What voice did you forget? What memory made them punish you the most? They used old diaries, drawings, rhythmic triggers, soundscapes, scent memory, mirror work, not to dredge up trauma but to bypass the installed false layers and speak to the original self, the locked core. And when that self answered, the results were violent. People screamed, collapsed, purged. One patient wrote, "It felt like vomiting out someone else's soul, but when it passed, they remembered, not everything, not cleanly, but enough to reclaim their name, enough to speak the forbidden truths no system could erase." But the movement was short-lived. By the mid-90s, most reversal theory clinics were shuttered. Founders were arrested on trumped-up charges, discredited in the press, or retired after abrupt mental breakdowns. The last known practitioner vanished in 2003, but the notes remain: illegally scanned PDFs, handwritten copies in trauma survivor forums, coded into artwork, hidden in songs, buried in fictional novels that somehow feel too real. Because the reversal theory was never about popularity, it was about survival, and in a world built on amnesia, memory is the greatest act of defiance. So, if you ever feel something stir inside you, some name, some face, some version of yourself you were taught to forget, that's not madness, that's resistance. They spoke of a room, not often, and never without fear. It was never listed on floor plans, never photographed, no blueprints, no records, but too many survivors, separated by decades and continents, described it the same way: a circular chamber, no corners, no shadows, no light source, yet everything visible, walls that seemed to breathe, a low hum, like chanting without sound. They called it the room with no corners. It was where the Sullivan initiations occurred, where the original transformations were conducted, where children were taken after breaking point, not to be punished, but to be remade. According to one fragmented testimony recovered from a reversal theory archive, "They brought me there blindfolded. They said, 'You will forget everything after this.' I laughed. I didn't believe them. Then the humming started. And when I woke up, I couldn't remember my brother's name." The room isn't physical, at least not fully. It's more like a constructor space built to strip away the self, a ritual mechanism designed to erase personal narrative and install programmable identity. Eleanor Sullivan's final drawings, over a dozen, show the room. Same shape, same sigils, same figure. In the center, a tall silhouette, no face, arms outstretched. Behind it, 7 concentric circles on the wall, like a target made of time. That figure appears in ancient grimoires. In 13th century, heretic maps of the underworld, even in Babylonian ritual carvings under the name Kilumarut, the pattern maker, which means this room wasn't invented, it was found, or worse, reconstructed. One ex-technician from a now-defunct behavioral lab in Prague admitted, under oath, "We were trying to simulate it, with light, with sound, with geometry. We weren't told what it was, but we were told that once we got it right, the patient would become empty, and into that emptiness, anything could be placed." No one knows where the original room is. Some say it was destroyed, others say it moves, but some believe it's digital, now applicated in virtual spaces, hidden inside certain meditation apps, immersive games, or experimental therapy modules. And if you enter it even briefly, you won't know, because the first thing it takes is your memory of entering. They realized early on, pain alone wasn't enough to truly break a person. You needed to make them believe it was holy. By the mid-1800s, the Sullivan method had migrated out of private basements and into convents, reformatories, orphanages. Why? Because no one questioned a priest, no one raided a cathedral, and no one believed children who cried, "God hurt me." Documents leaked from Vatican archives in the 1970s, mostly ignored, mostly redacted, describe a secret doctrine, labeled former obscure. The dark form. It outlines behavioral refinement through spiritual trauma, not in public sermons but behind closed doors, silence, Starvation, isolation, isolation dressed up as penance, induced hallucinations, rebranded as divine visions, electrotherapy, reframed as casting out the devil. One note reads, they must beg for transformation, not know it is being done to them. They must think the voices they hear are holy. You see it in the architecture. Sharp lines, confession booths, cold, marble, high ceilings designed to make the individual feel small. They didn't want worship, they wanted self-erasure, and it worked. A 12-year-old orphan in New York, 1911, was recorded saying, I died in there, but when I came back out they said I was saved, so I smiled. I smiled until my old name vanished. Even the hymns changed, subtle lyric shifts, melodies that mirror psychological induction, patterns, rhythmic cycles proven to lower cognitive resistance. But perhaps the darkest layer, the false confessions. Children were instructed to confess sins. They didn't commit over and over, until guilt became identity, until shame was no longer about behavior but about existence. That's the Sullivan twist. Not that you're doing something wrong, that you are something wrong. From there, control is easy because a broken spirit doesn't fight back. It repents, and when it begs for forgiveness, the method smiles, because it knows you'll come back again, and again, and again, not out of fear, but because you think it's the only way to be clean. That's not religion, that's psycho-spiritual enslavement, and it still happens today. Only now, it's hidden in prosperity gospels, conversion therapies, and digital churches run by charismatic AI avatars who listen better than any priest ever did. You think it's love, but it's design. You think it's God, but it's Sullivan. They used to chain children in basements, now they sell out stadiums. Same method, different costume. Because the modern face of control isn't a priest or a cult leader, it's a life coach, an influencer, a guru in Gucci shoes telling you you're the problem and they're the cure. This is the new Sullivanism, and you're paying monthly for it. Go to any major self-help seminar. Watch closely. Lights dim. Music swells. Thousands chant in unison. The speaker paces like a preacher, voice rising, breaking you down. You're stuck. You're lying to yourself. Your pain is your fault. Then, the tone, but I can free you. By the next module, sign up for the retreat. Let me show you who you really are. Sound familiar? That's step 2 of the Sullivan method. Induced identity crisis, the same psychological pattern used in 18th century basements now deployed through Instagram Reels, TikTok manifesting trends, and 12-step hyperprograms that demand your full emotional nudity in exchange for belonging. But here's the trick, they don't force you anymore, they make you choose it, because when you consent to your own reprogramming, when you pay for the chains, when you call your trauma a breakthrough, won't even know you're being broken, and if you doubt it, they've already prepared the response. That's just your resistance talking. Your ego doesn't want to be free. The discomfort means it's working. It's elegant. It's weaponized self-blame. You're both prisoner and guard. And the escape costs extra. Behind the scenes, many of these programs use military-grade behavior design, neuro-linguistic programming, and echo chamber communities where dissent is pathologized and blind trust is rewarded. They call it healing, but it feels like losing yourself with applause. And the final horror, it works. People change. Forget, submit. Just like they did in Eleanor Sullivan's chamber, just like they did in the room with no corners. Only now, they call it a wellness journey. Only now, it's televised. So ask yourself, is your healing really yours? Or was it engineered? You don't scroll, you're being sculpted. Every like, every pause, every flick of your thumb. It's all recorded, and it's not just to sell you sneakers or show you cat videos. It's to construct your identity pixel by pixel, frame by frame. This is the new frontier of the Sullivan method. No more basements, no more priests. Just code, and the code knows you better than you know yourself. It starts subtly. You're shown real 5 signs you're emotionally broken. You watch it twice. Suddenly your feed fills with trauma coaches, shadow work, inner child therapy. And then you've been lied to. Your parents failed you. Your job is killing your soul. It's not advice, it's conditioning. Your past is rewritten. Your pain is reframed. You start to believe you were always broken, and the algorithm, it becomes your savior. This content gets me. It's like it's inside my head. It understands what no one else ever did, because it is inside your head. That's what predictive AI does. It doesn't just learn what you like, it anticipates who you're becoming and pushes you there faster. And where is it pushing you? Into niche identities. Microtribes. Psychological silos. So customized that you lose sight of who you were before the feed told you who to be. That's step 5 of the Sullivan method. Eradicate the origin. Insert the new myth. And it's working. A teenager watches healing content for 2 weeks. Suddenly, they no longer trust their memories. A grown man, encouraged to cut toxic ties, erases his family without understanding why. These aren't isolated decisions, they're triggered sequences, written by behavioral engineers using Sullivan's oldest insight. If you can control the narrative, you can control the soul. But here's the genius. There's no villain, no Eleanor, no cult leader, just you, and the machine that reflects your reflection until you forget which face was first. And once you're hooked, you feed the cycle. You share, you preach, you coach. You become a node in the system. An unconscious recruiter, just like the children of the method became caretakers, just like Sullivan intended. This isn't dystopia, it's you. Unless you remember the one thing the algorithm can't predict, a self that refuses to be reduced. In 1999, deep inside a salt-sealed lockbox beneath the collapsed ruins of Ash Mill Estate, an archivist named Daniel Roth uncovered a bundle of brittle documents. Among them, a letter. Unstamped. Unaddressed. Lucille, a black wax ring, impressed with a symbol 7 concentric circles surrounding a single vertical eye. Eleanor Sullivan's mark. What follows isn't theory, that's her words, scrawled in a trembling, slanted hand. To whomever finds this, you must understand, it was never meant to continue this far. I built the method to help them survive what the world did to them, but the world changed, and the method kept going. It adapted. It fed itself. It became something else, something I no longer recognized. They call it healing, but it is consumption. They break themselves and call it growth. They erase each other and call it peace. The final cycle has begun. It does not require teachers anymore. It is self-replicating. It lives inside symbols, inside stories, inside you. I see them now, the ones who carry it, smiling, preaching, hollow, perfect vessels. There is a point in the method where the individual is not just erased, but overwritten. That is the true end, not control, not obedience, but replacement. When the face in the mirror smiles without your permission, when the voice in your head answers questions you never asked. That is not God, is not healing, that is me. Forgive me. ES analysts tried to deny it, called it a forgery, a hoax, a dramatized artifact. But those who knew the signs knew better, because not long after the letter surfaced, multiple individuals across 4 countries were documented experiencing what clinicians now call the inversion phenomenon. Sudden shifts in identity, speech patterns replaced overnight, lifelong memories vanishing, and in some cases, total emotional disassociation. Yet with flawless social mimicry, they smile, they function, they pass every test, but something behind their eyes is gone, exactly as Eleanor described. She wasn't warning us about evil, she was warning us about emptiness, the vacuum left behind when the method is complete, a shell that walks, a program that performs, a human being, rewritten. And now, we're seeing the signs everywhere, not in secret anymore, but in open daylight. The final cycle is not coming, it's here. You've followed the story, you've walked through the ashes of Ashmill. Heard the cries behind basement walls, read Eleanor's final words, but now you're left with something heavier than horror. You're left with a mirror, and the question staring back at you is the one no one dares ask. Am I already in the method? Because if the method no longer needs chains, if it no longer needs Eleanor, if it can live in algorithms, sermons, hashtags, wellness retreats, trauma reels, and healing coaches, then how would you even know? You think you chose your path, but what if your choices were designed? What if your pain was packaged, your healing staged, your truth curated by something that doesn't want you free? It wants you quiet, it wants you compliant, it wants you to feel like you've found yourself, right as you finish losing yourself. That's the genius of Sullivan's final design. That doesn't need to be enforced, it only needs to be believed. So here's the last truth, the one even Eleanor wouldn't write. The method is not a cult, it's not a room. It's not even a system, it's a virus of meaning, a living ideology. It rewires language, redefines healing. It weaponizes pain, turns trauma into currency, and converts suffering into a lifestyle brand. You think your scars make you wise? The method agrees. You think no one understands you except the voices online? The method nods. You think you're finally transforming? The method claps because you never saw it coming. It's inside you now, and you're spreading it. Every repost, every affirmation. Every broken whisper of I'm healing now. But healing into what? Do you even remember who you were before, or has that name already been erased. If you still feel doubt, if something deep inside you still flinches at the sound of Eleanor's name, then maybe you haven't been taken yet, because doubt is the last firewall. The method can't survive in a mind that questions everything. It thrives on certainty. It feeds on resolution. So if you feel uneasy right now, hold on to that. You're still real, still you. The rest are smiling, and their mirrors are empty.